Welcome to sinister serials, where shadows whisper and every tale chills to the bone. Thriller Thursday brings tales of survival, where every shadow could be your last. Dive into the depths of the mind with Labyrinth of the Unseen, this Thriller Thursday. Follow Elaine Mercer, a New York psychologist, as she deciphers a cryptic letter leading her to an abandoned warehouse and into a mysterious labyrinth. Inside, reality warps, as her patient's phobias and her own traumatic past manifest in terrifying ways. As Elaine confronts the labyrinth's creator, she must navigate a maze of psychological terror. Will she uncover the truth, or will the labyrinth claim her sanity?
Elaine's heart pounded in her ears as she hesitated before the dimly lit room, her hand trembling violently against the tarnished doorknob. With a deep breath to steady her fraying nerves, Elaine pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest like the anguished wail of a tormented soul. The sound reverberated through the cavernous space beyond, raising the hairs on the back of her neck. As she stepped inside, Elaine's eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, her gaze falling upon the towering bookshelves that lined the walls like silent, malevolent sentinels. Their shadows seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering candlelight, casting distorted shapes that danced at the edges of her vision. The air was thick with the musty scent of aged paper and long-forgotten secrets, a cloying aroma that seemed to cling to the back of her throat with every breath. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, motes dancing in the meager light that filtered through the grimy windows set high in the walls. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk, its surface strewn with scattered papers and faded photographs. Elaine approached it cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet beneath her feet. Up close, her breath caught in her throat as she took in the intricate carvings that adorned the desk's edges. Strange, arcane symbols and grotesque faces seemed to leer out at her from the dark wood, their twisted expressions shifting and contorting before her eyes, as if mocking her curiosity. With a trembling hand, Elaine began to sift through the detritus on the desk, her eyes feverishly scanning each document for any clue that might shed light on the labyrinth's twisted secrets. The shadows seemed to close in around her, pressing against her shoulders like a physical weight, as if the very walls themselves were conspiring to keep the labyrinth's dark truths concealed. A small, leather-bound journal caught Elaine's eye, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed maps. Its cover was embossed with the same strange symbols she had seen carved into the desk. With trembling fingers, she plucked the journal from its resting place, a shiver running down her spine as she traced the raised patterns on its surface. The journal fell open in her hands, the pages brittle and crackling with age. Elaine's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the first entry, the handwriting a jagged scrawl that seemed to writhe and twist before her eyes. As she read on, a growing sense of horror and revulsion washed over her, her stomach churning with each revelation. The journal was a twisted chronicle of the labyrinth's creation, a sick and twisted testament to its architect's obsession with the human mind. Page after page was filled with detailed observations and clinical notes, each one a cold and calculating dissection of the subjects who had been lured into the labyrinth's clutches. Elaine's hands shook violently as she read the accounts of psychological manipulation and meticulously crafted torments, each one a calculated assault on the deepest recesses of the human psyche. The words seemed to burn themselves into her mind, igniting a creeping sense of dread that threatened to consume her from within. But it was the final entry that truly chilled Elaine to the bone. In stark, uncompromising language, the labyrinth's creator laid bare their ultimate goal, to create a living, breathing monument to the power of the mind, a twisted playground where they could observe and manipulate the very fabric of human consciousness. The labyrinth was not merely a physical construct but a psychological gauntlet, each twist and turn carefully calibrated to shatter the minds of those who dared to enter. Elaine's vision swam, the words on the page blurring and distorting as if the very fabric of reality itself was unraveling before her eyes. She blinked rapidly, fighting to maintain her tenuous grip on sanity as the foundations of her understanding crumbled beneath her feet. She knew that she had stumbled upon something far greater and more terrifying than her darkest imaginings, a twisted labyrinth of the mind that threatened to consume her very sanity. The revelation had cracked open the door to a realm of psychological horror that she had never dared to confront, and now, there was no turning back. With a shaking hand, Elaine closed the journal, her fingers lingering on its worn cover as if she could somehow absorb the terrible secrets it contained through touch alone. Even as the horror of her discovery threatened to overwhelm her, Elaine felt a flicker of something else stirring within her, a grim determination, a steely resolve to see this nightmare through to its bitter end. She had come too far, had sacrificed too much, to turn back now. She would unravel the labyrinth's secrets, would confront its architect and demand answers for the lives they had destroyed and the minds they had shattered. As she tucked the journal into her pocket, Elaine's gaze fell upon a small, ornate key that had been hidden beneath the book. It glinted in the dim light, its surface etched with the same strange symbols that adorned the journal's cover. Without thinking, she reached out and closed her fingers around it, the metal cool and heavy against her skin. She knew, with a sudden and terrifying certainty, that this key was the next piece of the puzzle, the next step on her twisted path through the labyrinth's depths. And though every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee this nightmare and never look back, Elaine knew that she could not. She had to see this through, had to confront the darkness that lurked at the heart of the labyrinth, and the shadows that haunted her own fractured psyche. With a deep, shuddering breath, Elaine tucked the key into her pocket alongside the journal. She cast one last glance around the cluttered room, her eyes lingering on the towering bookshelves and the grotesque carvings that leered at her from every surface. Then, with a final, determined set to her jaw, she turned and strode out of the room, ready to face whatever horrors the labyrinth had in store. As she stepped back into the twisting corridors beyond, Elaine couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed some invisible threshold, that she had stepped into a world where the very fabric of reality was beginning to fray at the edges. But she pushed that thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. She had a mystery to unravel, a twisted game to win, and a monster to confront at the heart of this nightmare. And though the road ahead was shrouded in impenetrable darkness, a twisted, treacherous path that seemed to beckon her towards madness itself, Elaine knew that she would not falter. For in the end, the only way out was through the labyrinth's twisted depths, and she would not rest until she had emerged victorious, or until her fractured psyche had been consumed by the nightmare entirely. Elaine staggered from the clutches of the accursed chamber, her mind splintering under the weight of the journal's profane revelations, each shuddering breath feeling like shards of glass raking her lungs. The labyrinth's serpentine corridors unfurled before her in a dizzying kaleidoscope of shifting shadows and malevolent geometries, their very foundations seeming to warp and undulate with each blink of Elaine's eyes, reality itself fraying at the edges. Elaine's trembling fingers coiled around the ornate key like a viper's embrace, its weight an ominous talisman, each jagged edge biting into her flesh as if eager to draw the blood that would seal her fate in the horrors yet to come. Elaine inhaled a ragged gasp that tasted of stale ashes, her body propelled forward by a desperation that transcended rational thought. Her footfalls ricocheted through the labyrinth's maw like the frantic pulse of a dying thing, each echoing step carrying her deeper into the twisted crucible designed to forge madness from the fragile matter of the human mind. She was adrift in a waking nightmare, with no map to guide her beyond the siren song of the labyrinth's secrets, secrets that beckoned with the promise of revelation even as they threatened to unmake the very essence of who she was. Elaine's thoughts fragmented into frantic shards as her foot ensnared on something unearthly, a malignant presence lurking just beneath the veil of dust and grime. She pitched forward, her palms slamming against the unyielding stone as a strangled cry tore from her throat. Twisting to locate the unseen threat, her gaze fell upon a trapdoor, its edge jutting from the filth-caked floor like the serrated maw of some profane beast, hungering to consume her. Elaine's fingers scrabbled at the encrusted filth, flecks of dried viscera crumbling beneath her nails as she gradually revealed a circular indentation at the trapdoor's heart. Its contours were sickeningly, inexplicably familiar, a creeping dread slithering up her spine as her gaze fell upon the ornate key clutched in her other hand. The shapes mirrored each other with an unspeakable intimacy, as if the profane artifact had been sculpted from the scar tissue of her own psyche. A shudder of revulsion shook Elaine's frame as she forced the key into the indentation's malign embrace, the mechanism within yielding with a guttural groan. The trapdoor swung open with ponderous reluctance, disgorging a foul miasma of stale air that carried the rancid reek of old blood and corruption. A yawning chasm gaped beneath, the shadows below seeming to shudder and undulate with a sickening vitality, as if the labyrinth's very foundations were composed of rancid, obscene flesh. Bile burned the back of Elaine's throat, but she swallowed it down, steeling herself against the rising tide of panic that threatened to consume her. This was no mere physical aberration, no random architectural quirk. The labyrinth had drawn her in with calculated malice, its unseen architect leaving a profane breadcrumb trail for her to follow, one that led ever deeper into the nightmarish recesses of her own fractured psyche. The shadows loomed hungrily before her, their pulsating rhythms echoing the frantic cadence of Elaine's heart as it hammered against her ribs. But even as every primal instinct screamed at her to flee, she knew there could be no retreat. The labyrinth had sunk its talons into her very essence, its tendrils of madness already worming their way through the cracks in her sanity. The only path left was the one that spiraled ever downward, into the profane depths where the architect's twisted machinations awaited her. Gathering what tattered shreds of courage remained, Elaine fixed her gaze on the beckoning shadows and stepped into the void. The descent was a nightmare plummet through fractured planes of existence, each indrawn breath laced with the cloying stench of rot and long-buried trauma. Elaine's footfalls struck solid earth one moment, only to splash through viscous pools in the next, the brackish liquid clinging to her skin with obscene intimacy. The shadows congealed and dissipated in turn, revealing glimpses of unnatural landscapes that warped and shifted in sickening defiance of spatial logic. Elaine's mind reeled, her senses assaulted by a kaleidoscope of horrors as the labyrinth enacted its sadistic psychomachia upon the fragile architecture of her sanity. She clutched at her temples, nails scoring crimson furrows as she fought to maintain even a tenuous grasp on reality. But the foundations were already crumbling, each certainty transmuting into a grotesque chimera born of the labyrinth's profane machinations. At last, the plunging darkness expelled her into a nightmarish aperture, a sickly greenish phosphorescence emanating from the towering stacks of filing cabinets that lined the chamber's diseased walls. Elaine gagged on the stench of putrescence and stale paper, her gorge rising as she fought against the encroaching delirium. This place reeked of the architect's handiwork, a profane reliquary housing the darkest secrets of the labyrinth's victims. As if propelled by forces beyond her control, Elaine's feet carried her towards the nearest cabinet, her fingers settling upon its corroded surface with a sense of grim inevitability. The drawers resisted her initial efforts, their contents seeming to withdraw from her desperate grasp. But then, with a shuddering groan of rusted metal, they yielded, disgorging their profane burdens in a susurrant avalanche of decaying files. Elaine's breath caught in her throat as she sifted through the spilled archives, each folder seeming to radiate an aura of preternatural dread. These were more than mere case files, they were ossified receptacles for the anguish and torment the labyrinth had inflicted upon its victims. Elaine's fingers trembled as they brushed against the desiccated surfaces, flakes of ancient misery sifting from their bindings like the shed husks of profane chrysalises. One folder in particular seemed to emanate a sickly, pulsating warmth that sank remor-like tendrils of dread into Elaine's psyche. Cradling it with numb, leaden fingers, she slowly unfurled its contents, each page alive with a feverish scrawl that blurred and danced at the periphery of her vision. This was no mere compilation of clinical notes, but the unraveled tapestry of a shattered existence, observations meticulously annotated with sadistic precision to chart the inexorable fracturing of a human mind. The pages blossomed with lurid, hallucinatory imagery, each graphic rendering a cold, surgical dissection of the soul-scouring torments inflicted upon the file's subject. Obscene anatomies took form in the ink blots and smears, flayed musculatures seeming to quiver with obscene vitality. Abject, dehumanizing epithets annotated each transgression against reality, their barbed cruelties sinking like rusted fishhooks into the tattered vestments of Elaine's composure. She recoiled, gasping for air, only to find the next folder radiating its own malignant penumbra. This one's binding had ruptured, its rancid pages spilling from a burst caesura like festering viscera. Wet, organic textures met Elaine's shuddering fingertips as she traced the paths of desecration scored across their surfaces, a diabolical cipher chronicling the subject's descent into the deepest pits of debasement and spiritual ruination. The visions unfolding across the violated folios transcended the purely psychological, etching themselves upon the very neurological fabric of Elaine's being. She could taste the caustic despair that had leaked like vitriol from the subject's disintegrating psyche, could smell the charnel reek of trauma's profound anatomical violations. Worse, she could feel the devouring weight of the subject's degeneration pressing down upon her own shoulders, a cosmic horror birthed from a profane melding of psyche and pathology. Folder after profane folder disgorged its reeking chronicle, their malign emanations bleeding together into a miasmic delirium. Faces took shape amidst the encroaching murk, visages contorted into wounds by the labyrinth's obscene probings. Elaine's hands were slick now, coated in substances that could only be defined as spiritual ichor. Spatters of stark obsidian stained the file's defiled pages, scabbing over each aborted possibility for redemption. And then, there it was. That one folder bearing an inscription that pierced the creeping liminality and lanced Elaine's heart with a barb of profane dread. Her own name inked in a scrawl that congealed the ruptured filaments of sanity her unraveling mind still clung to. The folder's cover seemed to shudder beneath Elaine's profaned gaze, its pages issuing a susurrus of inhuman misery. She fought to still the tremors that gripped her as she reached for its malign beckonings. This was no mere psychological conduit, no vicarious exercising of the labyrinth's horrors, this was the obscene autobiography chronicling her own initiation into a realm of profane revelation. The file's opening displayed a photograph that stole the air from Elaine's lungs like a tracheal constriction. It was an artifact from a past she had disavowed, a haunting effigy crystallizing into salience every betrayal and violation that had paved the path to this nightmare terminus. There she was, the fragile, haunted waif who still lurked in the crevices of her psyche, and towering beside that ghostly doppelganger, a demonic malefactor whose shadow occluded every flicker of light, every possibility of deliverance. Elaine's scream withered in her throat, curling back upon itself in a gestation of profane revelation. The dread pater's identity was finally laid bare in an epiphanic lancing of insight so profound it threatened to unmake the very continuum of her being.
No, dear! God, no!
Those condemned pages held no answers, no restorative epiphanies. Only a cold, corrosive truth as immutable and damning as the indelible etchings of her own corroded psyche. The labyrinth was no experiment, no demented clinical exercise, it was an ontological pit into which the unwary were cast to be flayed, spiritually eviscerated, and reborn as profane husks of their former selves. And at its malign heart, the architect cast its baleful gaze. Elaine's limbs trembled as she hauled herself out of the hidden chamber, the damning files in her pack weighing her down like an oppressive burden, a tangible reminder of the horrific truth she now bore. She emerged into the labyrinth's twisting corridors once more, her mind still reeling from the revelation of her mentor's betrayal. Staggering forward, her palm pressed against the frigid stone wall for support, Elaine battled the onslaught of memories, each one a razor-sharp sliver piercing the fragile fabric of her psyche, rending it asunder with merciless precision. She saw herself as a young student, eager and naive, hanging on her mentor's every word as he spoke of the wonders of the human mind. She remembered the long hours spent in his office, poring over case files and research papers, her admiration for him growing with each passing day. But now, those same memories were tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of what he had done. Every word of praise, every gesture of support, seemed hollow and false, a carefully crafted lie designed to lull her into a false sense of security. Elaine's heart twisted with a sickening mixture of grief and rage, her vision blurring with unshed tears as she stumbled blindly through the labyrinth's halls. Suddenly, without warning, the visions assaulted her, Twisted, nightmarish apparitions that slithered into the fissures of her fractured mind, inescapable and all-consuming. She saw herself as a child, cowering in the corner of a darkened room as raised voices echoed from beyond the closed door. She felt the sting of a slap across her face, tasted the coppery tang of blood on her tongue. And through it all, she heard her mentor's voice, cold and clinical, dissecting her trauma with the detached precision of a surgeon.
Subject shows signs of repressed childhood abuse.
He intoned, his voice echoing through the corridors of Elaine's mind.
Likely source of her fascination with psychology and her need to understand the darker aspects of the human psyche.
Elaine's hands flew to her ears, desperately trying to block out the sound of his voice. But it was everywhere, seeping into her thoughts like a poison, tainting every memory and every moment of their shared history. She saw herself in his office, tears streaming down her face as she poured out her deepest, darkest secrets. She had trusted him, had believed that he was the one person in the world who truly understood her. But now, she saw the glint of calculation in his eyes, the slight curl of his lip as he watched her bare her soul.
Subject exhibits classic signs of vulnerability and emotional instability.
He noted, his voice cold and clinical.
Likely to be highly susceptible to manipulation and control.
Elaine's heart shattered, the last fragile threads of her sanity unraveling as the truth of his betrayal crashed over her like a tidal wave. He had never cared for her, had never seen her as anything more than a test subject, a lab rat to be prodded and studied and dissected. And she had fallen for it, had let him into her heart and her mind, had trusted him with the most vulnerable parts of herself. The visions shifted, the walls of the labyrinth melting away to reveal a darkened room, lit only by the flickering glow of computer screens. And there, hunched over a keyboard, was her mentor, his face bathed in the sickly green light of the monitors.
The labyrinth is ready.
He murmured, his voice barely above a whisper.
The subjects have been chosen, their weaknesses and vulnerabilities carefully cataloged. It is time to begin the experiment.
Elaine's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She watched as her mentor's fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting commands and algorithms with a manic intensity. And then, with a final, triumphant flourish, he hit the enter key, and the screens went dark. The labyrinth shuddered around her, the very fabric of reality seeming to warp and twist as the experiment began. Elaine felt a searing pain in her head, a blinding white light that exploded behind her eyes. She screamed, her voice raw and ragged as she fell to her knees, her hands clawing at the stone floor. And then, silence. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. She knew now what she had to do, knew that there was no turning back from the path that lay ahead. Her mentor had betrayed her, had used her own deepest fears and traumas against her in the most twisted way imaginable. And she would make him pay for that betrayal, would confront him and demand answers for the hell he had unleashed upon her and countless other innocent victims. With a final, shuddering breath, Elaine squared her shoulders and set off down the corridor, her footsteps echoing with grim determination. She didn't know what fresh horrors the labyrinth had in store for her, what new revelations would test the very limits of her sanity. But she knew that she would not rest until she had unraveled the last of its twisted secrets, and come face to face with the monster who had orchestrated this nightmare. For in the end, the only way out was through, and Elaine would not stop until she had emerged victorious, or perished in the attempt. The betrayal had cut her to the core, had shattered the very foundations of her identity. But it had also forged her into something new, something stronger and more resilient than she had ever been before. And as she walked forward into the waiting darkness, Elaine felt a flicker of something that might almost have been hope. For the first time since she had set foot in this twisted labyrinth, she knew exactly who she was, and what she had to do. And nothing, not her mentor, not the labyrinth, not even the darkest depths of her own shattered psyche, was going to stand in her way.
Thank you for joining us on another spine-chilling journey, where nightmares come to life and horror knows no bounds. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, Don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're brave enough, step through the door and subscribe to Sinister Serials, where every day brings a new flavor of fear, from macabre Mondays to thriller Thursdays. And
Mystery.
don't forget to check out our other terrifying tales waiting to be discovered in our library of horror. Until next time, keep the lights on if you dare.